Einen schönen guten Tag nach Deutschland and a good morning to our US participants. My name is Eva Maria Marx. I'm the head of the press department at the German Consulate in New York. It is an honor to welcome you to today's event, which is already the fifth of our joint series dealing with disinformation. Today, we will talk about the history of disinformation, the role of technology in its spread, and the future of fake news. Thank you for joining us today on this kind of journey into the past. I'm very excited that we have two experts with us today, and let me start with Heidi Tworek. She's a distinguished Canada Research Chair and Professor at the University of British Columbia. She's an award-winning researcher in media, history, health communications, international organizations, and platform governance. Heidi directs the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions at UBC and holds senior fellow positions at several institutions. She's also the co-editor of the Journal of Global History and author of News from Germany, The Competition to Control World Communications 1900 till 1945. Dr. Walter J. Scheirer is Professor of Engineering in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Notre Dame and author of A History of Fake Things on the Internet, which is a rich background, and he has a rich background in both computer science and international relations. Walter brings unique perspective to the lessons learned from the past for the digital age. Both experts are committed to fostering a deep understanding of the ramifications of disinformation on our society. We are grateful to have you both with us today. Thank you so much for taking the time. And many thanks to you, Steve, President of the American Council on Germany, a dear friend of the consulate, and for once again helping us organizing this event and for moderating the discussion. I'm looking very much forward to our exchange. Thank you very much.
Herzlichen Dank, Eva. We are very happy to continue the collaboration with you and your colleagues at the German Consulate in New York. Each of our virtual events in this series dealing with disinformation has been fascinating, and I am certain that today will not be any different. Let me also add sort of my welcome to Heidi and Walter. We're delighted to have you both with us and very much interested in your contributions to our conversation. So propaganda and fake news are nothing new, right? And technological advances have always had an impact on how people get, consume, but also manipulate information and news. So whether we're talking about the invention of the printing press or the introduction of radio and then television or the arrival of the internet and now social media, each era seems to have seen an increase in the dissemination of misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, and indeed fake news. So I'm looking forward to sort of unpacking some of the historical elements of this, but also the role in which, or the role that technology plays in the spread of disinformation. And hopefully we'll also get into kind of your thoughts on what lies ahead. But let's start with that more historical approach, because both of you have looked at that a little bit more closely, and you've each looked at very different periods in history and very different kinds of developments. But I thought we could maybe start by having each of you share a couple of historical examples of how information has been manipulated. And let me just sort of maybe frame it as a question and start with you, Heidi, because your sort of observation of history is a little bit older than the period that Walter has looked at. What are some of those forms of disinformation that have caught your attention and caused you to look at them a little bit more closely, and why?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. And thank you so much to you and the German Consulate for having me. I'm currently in Bielefeld in Germany, so it feels appropriate to be doing an event in concert with you. So, I mean, one facetious but actually important way to think about this is to go all the way back to the beginning of newspapers in the 17th century. So as soon as we get newspapers, which initially start mainly reporting on foreign relations, we also get all kinds of faking. So much so that Ben Jonson, the famous satirist, second only to Shakespeare in some ways in the 17th century, one of the things that he writes in the 1620s is a masque, an masque, it's a short play, where he's basically making fun of people for being so gullible that they would even believe that there were people living on the moon. So it's, I think, a good example of reminding us that as soon as we get newspapers, we also have lots of gullibility, lots of concern about fake news. We've even got the satire about fake news at the same time. But of course, the ways in which disinformation have functioned have waxed and waned and changed in really important ways over the course of the intervening 4 centuries. And I'll just give a couple of, I think, interesting examples. One is that what we've really come to recognize, I think, is that disinformation is often pushed by people who have an economic motive, and it can occur sort of anywhere. So one example that's really caught my eye, because I also work on the history of health communications, is that if you look at newspapers in the 19th century, in the US, they are just full of advertisements for quack medicines. I mean, things that will claim if you drink X, suddenly your tuberculosis will be gone by the next day, Mrs. Blah Blah's magical potion, et cetera, because there was no federal regulation on this kind of advertising in the 19th century. So it reminds us that the advertising model of news is a big part of what drives these pushes towards different kinds of disinformation and faking, which can often happen for profit. Mm-hmm. And that once we deal with those incentives, that's when we can maybe reduce the amount of, for example, medical faking that we now have, because we have the FDA that regulates that. And then to give one example of political disinformation, we know that states become really interested in using this in different ways. And the outbreak of World War II is a classic example of that, where the Nazis want to try and find some way of planting news so they can pretend that the Poles have attacked them first, so that September 1939 is supposedly a retaliation for that. So they're trying to seed and pretend that there is some sort of attack, so that then this news gets disseminated, so the rest of the world will think this is not an unprovoked attack. And that's just one of course, a bazillion examples of political disinformation as well.
And I'm sure over the course of our conversation, you'll both have opportunities to sort of share some different examples and maybe go into a little bit more depth on some of them. But Walter, I'd love to bring you in and ask you sort of the same question of, as you've looked back, what have been some of those forms of disinformation that have caught your attention and made you want to probe them a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. But first, of course, I'd like to thank the American Council on Germany, Steve, Ava, the consulate for putting this together. I think this is, again, a fantastic event and a good conversation to have, right? Especially as elections are coming up this year. So what examples have I looked at? A lot of my work in computer science has been about visual media. In the world of AI, I primarily work in the area of computer vision. And so for many years, I've been interested in the history of photography, from the invention of the camera to the present day with generative AI and different forms of image creation. And what's really fascinating, again, a lot of the contemporary conversation is around allegedly new approaches, new ideas in faking imagery, but a lot of that turns out to be long-standing. So in my book, I've looked at the history of photography. What was possible in terms of image editing in the 19th century? It turns out a lot. As soon as the camera is invented, you have photographers faking their photographs. In fact, in the 1840s, one of the inventors of an early camera process, Hippolyte Bayard, in France, creates what is generally acknowledged to be the first photograph. And it is, I'd say, a piece of disinformation. It's a protest image. Bayard is very upset that his process is not receiving the same attention as the daguerreotype process. And he believes he's being unfairly treated by the French government, which is backing this competing invention. So he creates this photograph of himself as a corpse. He's in this like ghastly makeup, right? So it appears that he's dead. And the most interesting thing about this fake photograph, it's accompanied by a little story, like a satirical story, where he lays out his case, why he is being wronged, and something should be done about it. And it's very much over the top, and it's very reminiscent of the type of like parody and satire you see on the internet today. If you're familiar with like online communities on like Reddit and 4chan, again, a lot of places we're concerned about because of political disinformation. But this like form of communication, right, is sort of set very early on. And from there, it's sort of spirals, right? But in good ways in most cases. Darkroom technicians develop a lot of interesting techniques for editing images. Again, we think this is something new, something that appeared with Photoshop in the 1980s, but it turns out if you sat for a professional portrait in a studio, you know, say in the 19th century, you could order special effects. You could, you know, have your complexion cleaned up. That was possible. You could have objects inserted into the photographs. Again, a lot of these operations that we're thinking about now digitally, all of that existed. And of course, right, some of that is eventually used for political purposes, but a lot of it was just used for personal purposes or using photography as a creative medium, which again, like looking back is not surprising.
But that's really interesting to think about it that way and to actually identify that some of the things that we're seeing today and getting upset about are not that new, right? They've existed for a while. But what I find really interesting about what both of you said is sort of this element of satire in what Heidi was talking about with, you know, some of the stories about people living on the moon, from your anecdote just now, Walter. And I'd be curious, you know, is this to be seen as a form of entertainment, or is it more that whoever was behind it was really trying to take advantage of gullible people? Sort of how do you sort of see this element of satire, or is it hard to say that there's a one size fits all, but that different people use this tool of disinformation for different purposes at different times?
Do you want to go first, Walter, and talk about the images?
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's an invitation. I'll bring up one additional example, which I think is really fascinating. So Jonathan Swift, right, like very, very interesting writer who sort of pioneers, I think, like a good technique of fake news, which he uses in a political context. So he writes a pamphlet, which at the surface level, so this is his pamphlet, A Modest Proposal. If you read the surface level narrative, right, it's about eating babies, right? It's a very transgressive piece of writing. It creates an uproar when it's published, but the pamphlet is not about cannibalism, right? It's really commenting on the state of the poor in Ireland, right? He's making a really important political point.
Mhm.
But it's so sensational you can't help but look at it, right? It generates a huge amount of attention. And I think they're really interesting parallels when you look at the internet and transgressive writing there. A lot of commentators stop at the surface level message, just like many people did when Swift released his pamphlet. And what's even more hilarious about this pamphlet too, like occasionally like contemporary like controversies like arise over it, right? Like there are like public readings sometimes, and again, like there's like an outcry, like, wait, we can't advocate for the consumption of babies. And again, I feel like the internet's like this too, where again, a lot of like very aggressive language is used, or like, you know, exaggerated circumstances, and it generates an uproar. And that's part of the reason it's created, right? To get the eyes on the message. But if you think deeply, then you get the intent, right? So there are multiple levels of analysis. And really good satirical writing is like that. So again, like one sort of interesting example that has stood the test of time and creates a template.
Yeah,
So much
yeah,
so
that's
that I
great.
remember studying it at school. But I think this is I think part of the point is that sometimes satire helps to then point out the absurdity of, say, a news ecosystem. So
Right.
we exist in a news ecosystem that wasn't necessarily wholly healthy pre, say, 2016. There were already a whole host of problems, and satire is one way of of pointing that out, but it's also a way of creating in and out groups, to build on Walter's point, the in group of people who understand that it's satire and the out group of people who don't quite get it. And you can think of a lot of ways in which that functions on the internet with micro communities, right? These much smaller groups of people on Reddit or wherever, and it's a few hundred people, but the transgressive joke is to show who gets it, who doesn't, to create your in and out community. So that's maybe another way to think about what satire is trying to do.
Mm-hmm. So as you reflect back, and have to think about sort of your top of the pops or top 10 disinformation campaigns, what are the one or two that come to mind as being the most successful, and who was behind them? Yeah, anything come to mind right away? I mean, I don't know. Is there like a really good bad, perhaps, but
Yeah,
sort
so
of...
in my book, I look at a number of these cases. One in particular that I think is just endlessly fascinating. So in the 1990s, a group of computer hackers created what is essentially fake news. Like they implant like a false story in an episode of Dateline NBC. And the journalists are covering this new subculture of computer hackers. Computer hackers, as it turns out, like we're very early to enter into like information networks, and they're fascinated not just with the technology itself, but the messages that are spread through technology. And some of them are thinking very deeply about how to use the media for their own purposes. So these hackers create a false story about UFOs. And the journalists, because this is so new and they're looking for some like sensational like aspects to the story to get viewers, they just kind of matter-of-factly report that the hackers had recovered all of this evidence of UFO craft at various military installations. And there's like somebody dressed, kind of like, yeah, it's like the person's like face is like obscured, the voices change, they look kind of mysterious, like someone is like play acting this out. And NBC News just runs this, right? And what's really interesting about it, I'd say it's very successful because number one, it makes it to TV. And number two, the subculture loves this and they keep working on this narrative through like internet writing for years. They hold conferences where they have talks on the supposed UFO material. And it's a subculture prank, and the in-group gets it, right? I love this framing of, the in-group and the out-group.
Yeah.
And I just, I can't believe what was NBC thinking, right? And it wasn't very difficult to do. And I interviewed, a number of people that were sort of involved in this, and they sort of had developed strategies in terms of how to speak to a reporter, right? Like give them like what they're looking for, and then sort of, insert your material, like piggybacking off of that, and it will appear.
But what's fascinating about this is sort of that sense of sensationalism that has come up in many of these, extreme stories before, but also in a case like that, something went wrong with the fact checking. Right? Whoever it was,
exactly
did not do that other side that you think that journalists are always doing, of vetting the stories and making sure that this is actually true. And I think that there's a reason why we're seeing so much fact checking today, particularly in a political context as well. But your anecdote is a really good one for how, even in the 90s, things weren't working quite the way that they should have.
Yeah, exactly. And the fact-checking aspect came up too. There was like a critical response by some academics, right, who were aware of this episode, who were actually approached by the producers, like immediately sensed what was going on, and sort of called it out in a newsletter that was reporting on these like, computer security matters.
Yeah, let me come up with then some contrasting examples, I guess, more political ones. So some of which I'll give you two for the end of World War one of which is more of a mistake and one of which is more deliberate. So as it comes to November 1918, like everyone kind of senses this war is going to be over at some point imminently, but exactly when, no one's quite sure. And then there are two main competing news agencies in the US, and one of them, the United Press, mistakenly sends out a notice that World War I is over several days before it actually happens. And this actually because the news agency gets printed in a bunch of newspapers, and people actually go out on the street and start celebrating, like, yes, the war is over, only to find out when they return home, no, the war is not over yet. And for decades, of course, the Associated Press is always talking about how the United Press called this one wrong, right? Got it completely wrong, that it's the end of World War I. So you can think of that as an innocent mistake, but it still had ramifications. I mean, not terrible ones, but still, there are plenty of, I think, other examples where things happen that change the course of a day at least. And then there are others that have remained unknown almost up to the present. So at that very same time, within Germany, there's obviously tremendous political turmoil. The Kaiser decides to flee from Berlin, and then the interim chancellor is worried there's going to be a communist uprising. So he decides that what he needs to do is send out to the main news agency, which will then go to all the newspapers, news that the Kaiser has abdicated, because that will be a way of stemming this potential communist revolution. The Kaiser had done nothing of the sort. So he gets this information. He's raging. He's fled to the Netherlands. He's really peeved about all of this, but is totally unable to overturn it. And so this actually remains as the narrative for basically 100 years until I wrote my book, and go through and uncover, when you really reconstruct the day, you see that actually the Kaiser had not abdicated. He is abdicated by a political figure. So I think that shows us, you could call that an act of disinformation done to try and prevent communist revolution, but still something that really changes the course of history.
Well, and it certainly is the manipulation of information, right? And so that kind of leads to sort of another question of, all of these terms are bandied about, whether it's disinformation, misinformation, fake news, propaganda plays into this as well. How do you, as experts in this field, sort of differentiate between the two? Because they have a lot of common elements and common tactics, but maybe for those of us who are lay people, how do you differentiate between these different forms of manipulation of information?
Yeah, maybe I'll start and just say I do there's two levels to it that you can think of. One is the question of how these terms emerge in history and when they emerge and when they get used. So, for example, propaganda initially means to propagate the faith in the Catholic Church, right? And it comes to mean propaganda as we now understand it during and after World War I. So there's that kind of level on which you can analyze each one of these terms. When do they emerge historically? What do they mean? Why do they emerge when they do, etc.? So that's one level, and I'm happy to talk more about any one of those if people are interested, because all of them get used in the past, and there are fights about what they mean and so on. And then there's, of course, what they mean today. So the easiest one, I think, is the dis versus misinformation. So disinformation is something that's deliberate. So you can think D and D, something where we have some evidence that is deliberately done. So the example that I just gave about that the chancellor is one where he knows it's not correct and is spreading it anyway. So you could think of that as disinformation. Whereas misinformation is something that could be mistaken, or it's not necessarily that somebody means to disseminate something that is incorrect. So mistaken misinformation. And it's often hard to distinguish between the two, because getting to people's intentions is hard. Did they really mean to spread something that was incorrect? Or, who is the tracing something back to the originator can be quite complicated. But there are times where we can definitively prove it. And then in terms of, I think fake news has become for many reasons quite difficult to use, because it's also now a political term that's used to abuse media that are not pursuing anything that we would recognize as disinformation. So I think most scholars and others tend to not use that term anymore, although we still certainly talk about faking, because that again has lots of history to it. And then finally, propaganda. While in the history it's debated whether propaganda is a good or a bad thing, most of us now see it as something that's nefarious in some way, that is done by states in order to advance their own interests, and not necessarily something that democratic states would support.
Yeah, well, to that.
Yeah, I think just one note on propaganda too. I think it need not be fake, which is interesting. Right, especially when you look at the 20th century and like propaganda in America, like patriotism. And then also, like early thinking, Edward Bernays, social engineering comes into play quite a bit, right? It's like, can you sort of, not necessarily manipulate people, but create content or media that will move them in a direction, right? They'll take action based on what they're observing or what they're participating in. And again, that may not be fake. It may not be in their
Right.
best interest either, but there's some like nuance, I think, to that term in particular.
Yeah, and
So
Bernays is such an interesting figure, if I can, Steve, because he's arguing the 1920s propaganda is a good thing. So there's a whole bunch of
Yeah.
people who work for the
right.
U.S. government, like Walter Lippmann, and they come out after World War I. And they're like, this was bad. The state should not be involved in pushing information like this. We think this is really problematic. And Bernays like, no, this is great. I mean, look, we can do all sorts of stuff. Anyway, and he also gets involved in a whole host of things that we now think of as PR, and some people see him as the father of
Yeah,
PR. So he's
exactly.
helping people figure out how do you use psychology so you can get women to smoke. And some people think of him as the originator of getting doctors to be the people advising things to happen, like doctors advising people to eat bacon for breakfast because it's healthy, and that he has a whole host of those different techniques. But it's a really interesting moment of these debates about where the state should be, what it should be doing, and a whole host of people saying we think this is not good, and some saying no, we think this is actually really helpful because it will be helpful for democracy if we use these techniques to help people understand what's going on. But now, as Walter said, we've moved in a world where propaganda has a negative valence, but it doesn't mean the content has to be untrue.
Yeah. I think I know the answer to this, but I definitely wanted to pivot a little bit and hear from each of you why you think we should be using a historical lens to explore some of the disinformation and misinformation that we're seeing today, and how that history can help inform our understanding of the challenges that we're facing today. And we actually just got a viewer question that sort of speaks to something you were talking about a little bit earlier, Walter, that might help us sort of step in that direction of putting history in the context of where we are today. The viewer writes that they are curious to know how digital media and algorithmic sorting has changed the in-group, out-group dynamics that you were talking about. Does social media change our level of exposure to our out-groups compared with previous forms of media? And how does this change how we engage with media narratives as a whole?
Yeah, this is okay. So this is a great question. And again, I think it does connect to the history because this is something new, right? Historically, the media did not
Right,
have an algorithmic feed. It's like the
right.
radio was a broadcast, everybody was listening to it and getting the same message. Um, I think like these feeds, I think are generating a lot of misunderstanding. Like we were talking earlier about this in-group, out-group signaling, and specifically like parody and satire. What I think the feeds end up doing, again, you may have a community on some social media platform, again, producing a lot of transgressive material. And if you stop at the surface level message, it looks terrible, and bad, and something should be done about it. But the thing is, again, if it's produced for that community, for the consumption, like by other members of the community, probably fine. The algorithms steer people from outside of the community to these places, and then there is this uproar.
Mhm.
And again, a lot of misunderstandings. And where the internet is bad here, the in-group typically does not correct the out-group. In fact, in many cases, they think it's funny, it's a joke. And this adds more fuel to the fire. I think this is like really poor behavior. It's very antisocial.
Mhm.
But there's like an entire genre of like internet humor that follows this course. And when you bring that to a global scale, you end up with a lot of people misunderstanding things and fighting. And again, like policymakers chiming in. And it's a very noisy information ecosystem. And that's
Mhm.
very different from these other examples we've been talking about. Because again, the media was far more limited when you're restricted to television, film, newspapers. Again, much more gatekeeping. Again, you still see a lot of fake material there, but it's not the same interaction that you get in the current media ecosystem.
So you're both academics, right? You can sort of take a step back and study some of these things. I'm curious, have you seen sort of practitioners of disinformation also studying these older forms and formats of disinformation to see what methods or tactics they might be able to copy and use again today?
I can't think of any specific examples of that, but I guess I would say just to add one small thing onto what Walter said to the previous question is that a big debate has been about whether filter bubbles exist on the internet or not, and researchers now have mostly said no, actually, that's maybe not so much the problem. So what Walter describes is actually exactly that, right? Like you don't get that dynamic if you have a filter bubble. So that's just one thing to say, because I know the filter bubble thing is still very much out there, and I think it does speak to, there were certainly ways you could decide pre-internet that you wanted to try and learn about certain groups of people, but it was a more sort of deliberate thing, right? Like you had to go and buy the newspaper that was, say, of the different political persuasion than you were. It was a more active thing that you had to pursue rather than the passive, the algorithm delivers something onto your feed. So maybe that's another way of distinguishing between the two.
It
but in
didn't just
terms of
come to you, but you had to
exactly.
actually seek this out. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think that's one distinction. Not that people didn't confront all sorts of stuff, but it tended to be a little bit, perhaps that's one way I think, a little bit more active. And then I guess in terms of, I think that we certainly see people thinking about history. I mean, I've obviously spent more time maybe with people trying to deal with it than the people who are purveying disinformation. And I think that there is a deep interest in history. That I will say, hence how I've ended up sitting at the table with regulators quite frequently asking, what do we do? And I think that they, hopefully, a lot of them have moved beyond the belief that what is happening today is unprecedented. There was sort of spate of that, 2016, 17, 18, maybe a few cherry-picking examples, but I think we've moved a little bit beyond that. And that has real ramifications for two reasons. One is that because this is not a new problem, there is actually a whole host of legislation or court cases, et cetera, things that we can look back on that are how people in the past tried to deal with this problem. It doesn't mean that it's going to play out in exactly the same way, but it does at least give us one version of understanding, well, X was tried, what happened when we tried X? So I think that that's something that can hopefully be helpful, is to recognize that we're not confronting something unprecedented. And the second is that then one can sometimes actually use what's already on the book. Sometimes you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You need to enforce what's already there that maybe has been forgotten for some reason. You can go, dig back and then enforce what we already have. And actually, in the German case, Netzdigi, or the network enforcement law, was an example of that, because it was not creating the German law to enforce multiple aspects of speech law online. It created no new categories of speech that was deemed illegal. It merely said that what existed offline in terms of what was illegal now had to be enforced online. And we can critique the law, et cetera, but it was an example of actually using history.
So Heidi, you've totally anticipated the sort of direction that I wanted to go in next by sort of looking at the other side of what about those people who are trying to create more resilience and shore up the structures that exist, and what can be learned from the past. But before we come back to that, Walter, any thoughts on some of those nefarious actors who might be using some of these old strategies and dusting them off?
Yeah, so this is something I definitely examined when I was researching my book. Coming back to the computer hackers, so I wouldn't call the hackers nefarious, at least the hackers I examined in the book. These are people that basically ended up creating like the computer security industry, so they very much become like institutional figures over time. But the groups I talked to were very much interested in mass communications theory, Bernays. The term social engineering, if you look at literature on computer security today, like comes up quite a bit, because it's a way, again, to sort of like influence people, to get them to do things. Typically in a security setting, it's unauthorized access. And again, hackers are very interested in like reworking these techniques in a digital setting, right? Something very new. Coming then closer to the present, intelligence services are also paying attention to what is happening on the internet in the 1980s, the 1990s, early 2000s. Looking at, early cases of hacktivism, campaigns that were using information, again, in this like underground setting, and then sort of doing the same sorts of things. If you look at, remember the infamous like Guccifer 2.0 hacker, right? Like was presumed to be some sort of Russian intelligence operation. Again, the sort of like facts are hazy, right, in the space, but if you look at like the writing coming from that particular account, like it very much mirrors like this like earlier material that this subculture was producing. Like again, using some of the same like information techniques, trolling, right? Like we see a lot of that used in political contexts, but that was really nothing new when you look at what's happening on the internet in an earlier period. And so again, I just see like the sort of like fingerprints of this earlier era, like, in these more contemporary contexts that are clearly political, like there are clearly like international security concerns associated with them, et cetera.
So, I mean,
maybe Steve, if I can
yeah.
jump in, take in a slightly different direction, which is so the way that I've also thought about it is less about techniques, but more about the reasons why, particularly states are interested in pursuing this. So it seems obvious to us at this point that states think that information manipulation is an important thing to do, but it's actually not something that states per se have to do, right? So what I look at in my book is why is it that Germans become so interested in using communication and information to achieve all these political and economic goals? It's not obvious that you're going to do that. And we see that it's around 1900 as Germany, which is already a colonial power at that point, wants to become, a global power. They start to see an information system they think is boxing them in, and they want to use this new technology of wireless/radio to break out and use this information to try and increase trade and to affect global politics and to get people to feel more kindly about Germany, et cetera, et cetera. So then I show you, okay, how does this continue over 3 political regimes of 45 years? So the interesting question then is, why do states become interested in information at certain points for these geopolitical and economic purposes? And so that's something that we see repeated again and again, right? So when a state starts to think about becoming a global power, they look at things, think, okay, how can we really affect politics? It's quite hard, but information is comparatively cheaper and easier. So we see this happen. Soviet Union is an obvious example. China from the 1970s, very interested in trying to use its news agency, and then of course later CCTV, et cetera, to try and manipulate information or to put information from a Chinese perspective out there. And so I think thinking about places like Russia, Iran, China today, we see that same kind of international relations dynamic. And that's a helpful way of hopefully putting that aspect of motivation into context, even if some of the techniques are slightly different.
Well, but I guess one of the things that I think we're dealing with in a number of different areas is how technological innovations or technological advancements move much faster than the ability to control or regulate them, right? So how does one try to put guardrails in place that are almost anticipatory of what these technological developments might be? And can history play a role in that? Can history provide some lessons?
Ooh, this is a really tough question. Again, fundamentally, I'm a technologist, and everybody in the technology world wants to solve this with technology, and I don't really think it's possible. Especially like with trying to understand the veracity of information on the internet. There's a lot of discussion. Can we build detectors? Can we understand if an image has been manipulated or synthesized? The answer is yes. But as you pointed out, the technology moves so fast, that becomes a big problem because, oh, now there's a new algorithm and this detector is now old. It doesn't get the new content. And the internet, too, is something we should consider, again, in light of, historical understanding. So I think the internet in particular is an interesting medium in that it's participatory. It's filled with creative tools, right? Everything from Photoshop to generative models, right? That can, synthesize text and imagery and all these interesting things. And that very much conforms to the original thinking about what the internet should be, a creative space. So going back to the 1960s, Marshall McLuhan, right, basically has this vision for what we have now. He's very vocal about this, and he really engages the 1960s, 1970s counterculture. And a lot of folks come out of that and become engineers, right? And they want to build his global village, right? They think these ideas are very intriguing. This is how you get multi-user operating systems, information networks, right? How we're wiring up the globe, making transmissions quite easy, and building software that lets us project our imagination into this space. That I think is a frustrating piece of infrastructure if you're very much concerned about the facts, right, and truthful information, and have an older notion of the media. Right. So once you start throwing in the newspapers and the radio stations, right, the movies into the internet, it's colliding with all of these fictional narratives that people are
Right.
spinning up themselves. Um, and that is a very, very tough situation. So I
Right.
think, if you wanted to move forward, I think it's less about the technology. It's more about, number one, acknowledging that the internet is a creative space that is filled with fake things, and trying to carve out niches that are more or less trustworthy, right? Again, that could be the traditional media, knowing that papers of record are still papers of record. And yeah, they might get some stories wrong, right? And they probably do need to tone down the sensationalism a bit. But those are the places you go to for the facts, right? And again, this comes out of the 1990s thinking about the internet, where it's an information superhighway. As it becomes more corporate, there's this alternative to McLuhan's vision, which is the database of facts, right? We're going to do commerce here, and we're going to have educational activities in this space. And it's really frustrating. People keep polluting this internet with all of this storytelling. And again, that vision was just never achieved.
So you've kind of already started to answer this question, but you've said, and I think that this is part of the rationale and reason for your book, that concerns about digital misinformation are maybe somewhat overblown or alarmist, and that we shouldn't maybe get as wound up about them or as worried about them. And you've just talked a little bit about some of the positive sides and some of the positive uses of technology. Is there no reason at all to be concerned, or should we be concerned, but has the concern sort of gotten out of proportion in recent years?
Yeah, so great. Yeah, I don't want to say like, oh, everything is fine. Certainly not. I think anybody who has been on the internet in recent history knows that's not the case.
Exactly.
I think there's serious concerns. From my vantage point, I feel a lot of them are associated with partisan politics, right? And that, of course, affects many countries around the globe. It's not just an American problem. Again, there's an enormous amount of political content that is parody and satire that is being used by various political groups. There is also material that I would classify as propaganda. Now, what I think is interesting, again, there's a lot of alarmism around like deep fakes in particular, right? These very realistic looking videos that are indeed fake, a politician delivering a speech that they never delivered in the physical world, all of these things, swaying elections. But what I think is far more dangerous, and isn't talked about as much, political content circulating in the form of memes. Right. So it's the obviously fake material that people are paying attention to, that people are remixing, adding, right, additional messaging to, and in many cases are spreading dangerous messaging, right? We see memes associated with political conflict, right? Especially the Ukraine war. There's a tremendous amount of meme material that is just horrific. That's propagating public health matters, right? We worry a lot about the anti-vaccine movement, right? You see a lot of that messaging coming through in memes, right? Not dry speeches, right? Not more conventional media, right? It's in these jokes, right? Because that's how you sort of get people to pay attention, right? And then all of a sudden, right, like the more you're thinking about it, maybe there's something to this anti-vaccine thing, right? And then you have problems.
Maybe if I'll add a couple other dimensions to what Walter was saying. So I think there are some other ways that we can think about being concerned with the current ecosystem. One of which is a question of privacy. So the amount of data that can be collected about you to such a micro level, including how far have you scrolled on a news article, is at a level that the Stasi could only have dreamed of, right? And this is certainly something that's been of concern in Europe with the GDPR from 2018 onwards, but that enables a level of micro targeting to individuals, whether it has correctly identified all of the things they're interested in or not. That I think is one aspect of this that is new, is at least the level of detail which a certain number of companies hold on us. And the second aspect of it then is is understanding that this internet as we have it now, not the internet of the 1990s, but the one we have now, is one in which there's a small number of companies that effectively control advertising, and they are advertising companies. They may call themselves social media platforms, but what they actually make money from is advertising. So it goes back to my 19th century example of medicine, right? So the incentive is you collect all this stuff so that then you can sell your advertising, target it. And then if you want to think about how you create maybe a healthier ecosystem, you got to think about the incentives for the major companies who are in effect thinking about all of this advertising. Because even on a normal website, right, who is actually serving you the ads? You go back, it's actually Meta or it's Google, who are the two major ones there. So that's just a couple of other things that I think they take us a little bit away from saying, let's think about regulating the content, but rather what about the data that's underpinning all of this? And what about the companies themselves and their practices? There's a whole host of these antitrust suits and anti-competition suits that are being pursued now by state attorneys general in the US, or some ways in which the Europe's Digital Markets Act is also looking into some of these questions. And for some scholars, at least, they argue here are some ways that you can get at perhaps some of the problematic incentives in the internet ecosystem, but you don't have to think about what content you take down, something that can very quickly get extremely sticky and problematic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's really interesting, and that also sort of takes us into a different direction as well, which is we haven't talked that much about sort of generational divides. And I thought, particularly as you were talking just now, Walter, about some of the manipulation of information, and particularly political content, and how it's turned into memes. I don't really use memes, but I know that my daughter, who's 16, totally does. And so I was like, wait a minute, what about who is the most susceptible to some of the disinformation and misinformation that is out there? Is it young people? Is it old people? Can one tell? I'd be really curious in hearing from both of you sort of what your concerns are about different demographic groups in society and what they consume, and how we kind of work on media literacy across the board, because it's not just something where you need to get young people in middle school and high school. I would say that it's a generation-wide type challenge to make sure that people are aware of what they're consuming. And it comes back to what you were saying a little bit earlier, Heidi, about, there was a time where if you wanted to proactively understand what somebody with a different viewpoint thought, you would go buy a newspaper that was published by an organization that, or a publishing house that has a sort of different viewpoint. Today, information just comes to you, and you can find yourself in sort of a bit of a bubble.
Do you want to go first, Walter, or shall I?
I can get some thoughts on this. I think absolutely. There are definitely some generational divides, even in terms of the use of different mediums. You don't find a lot of older folks, at least here in the United States, using TikTok, for instance. But if you're a member of Gen Z, that is a major source of information. And so this becomes, right, a big dilemma, especially again for the more traditional news media, academia, etc., like places where traditionally like more reliable information has been found. I think media literacy though can help in that regard. I mean, number one, like newspapers have not gone away. The radio has not gone. Right? There's all these older mediums, like television is still around. I think making younger folks aware that there are alternatives, right? And especially like trustworthy alternatives, and explain like how the information is produced and how it's consumed is like different from medium to medium. Now, I do talk with folks in the media quite a bit. And I know folks, particularly in like television and radio, feel like this is the end, right? We're in the end times for these mediums. I don't believe that. Like these things don't necessarily have to go away. Like the internet doesn't have to be the only place we go to, right? There's like this like air of inevitability, but it's completely artificial. And again, I think there's so many great edited outlets for news, right? For information, right?
Yeah.
Right, like magazines, long form, writing is still around. I think making again, the younger generation is more aware that, there's a lot of good stuff here, right? And this medium has not gone away, and you should really pay attention to it. And you don't have to completely disengage from what you like on these services. Just know that there's more out there. And again, if you're looking for things that are more trustworthy, it's probably not TikTok, right? It's these other forms of communication?
Well, I think it probably has to do with sort of the devices that we're consuming the media on and sort of the freedom that we now have. I'm just thinking about all of the streaming channels that one has access to if one wants entertainment, right? And of course, you're absolutely right. You can get news and information in other ways. We're seeing that with a plethora of podcasts, which are basically mini radio stations. But
yeah.
Heidi, you of course wrote about the advent of radio and television. Do you think that radio and television are on their deathbed at the moment?
Well, I mean, it's that important recognition that when a new technology comes along, it doesn't automatically replace the older one; it supplements it in different ways. The distinction with the internet being that it can provide each one of those on itself, right? Like you can get you can get your radio program online now. You can watch that TV thing, whether it's on YouTube, et cetera, et cetera. But that doesn't mean that TV has completely gone away. It's just not going to be perhaps as dominant. So we're not going to have that era of, say, the 70s, where you have a couple TV channels. Everybody is having that similar experience because there's only a few places you're tuning in for your evening news. That isn't per se the end of the world, because the US in sort of the late 18th century, early 19th century, every town had their own local newspaper in different ways. So they were sharing some bits of information, but a lot of it was quite different. So I guess I would see it as it's a world where you have to work, if you are a public official or someone else, you have to work a lot harder to reach your different publics, because you can't just hold a press conference and it goes on TV and boom, you've reached everybody. So there's two sides to this, right? There's the getting people who are consuming things to realize that there are other outlets out there. But there's also, if you are, say, a public health official, and I did a lot of work on this during the pandemic, if you're a public health official, how do you make sure that you too create it doesn't have to be like a fancy meme, but some very clear information that you can also put on a bazillion social media channels? That's complicated if you don't have a lot of capacity for it, but it's actually really important because you also have to try and go to people and not just expect them to come to you. So it requires a little bit of a shift in thinking. And we've obviously seen some missteps when governments sometimes try to be jokey and it really lands poorly, and they don't have to do that. Right? You can just get the information out there in a way that is clear and sensible, because often people were just genuinely confused in the pandemic. They wanted to do the right thing, particularly young people I would speak to. They're like, I want to do the right thing, but I genuinely don't know what it is. Help me. And that's because they weren't watching TV press conferences. So I think that's another part of this, is that sometimes people fall for scams, et cetera, and sometimes people are just genuinely confused, and we can, I think, have compassion for that and then figure out how do we deal with that in this extreme multimedia universe we now operate in.
And so that comes back to, I think, a perennial question of how does one educate people about how to educate themselves, right? The term media literacy and that we need to do more about it is bandied about quite frequently. But it's, I think, hard to get a really clear definition from experts of what a, top line media literacy program would look like and what some steps are that one can take to be literate in this digital age. And I'd love to hear from each of you if you have any thoughts on strategies that have been effective in sort of helping foster critical thinking skills, what you're telling or advising your students, but also what you're advising your parents and grandparents about, how they might consume information.
Yeah, I think at Notre Dame, so I teach a very large class on technology ethics, and all of this is in the curriculum. And I think the most effective intervention is having a dialogue like the one we're having today, just talking through these ideas with the students, letting them engage with the ideas. What does not work is giving folks a laundry list of things, saying like, it's like, don't do this, do this. Like, no one's going to pay attention to that, right? Like people, they're going to like rebel against that, right? They're going to ignore it. But the students, I think if they're deeply engaged in the controversy and trying to understand why there is a controversy, all of a sudden they're rethinking their media use. And understanding that, I had no idea that there were all these alternative sources of information. Giving them some historical perspective on how the media has evolved. That's been really, really effective. Now, is that helpful for grandma? It's kind of a different context. But I wonder, in at least a community setting, could you bring people together to have a reasonable discussion about this? Because I feel, again, the alarmism is unhelpful. I feel, again, a lot of reporting on this has stopped at the surface level, which, again, is sort of hilarious if you're creating parody and satire, but ultimately unhelpful in many cases.
Yeah, I mean, luckily there's actually, a whole bunch of scholars who are working on exactly this question, because it's not just like tell people to read better. There's multiple different strands of what you can do. So one, for the more kind of student level, is something that's much more active. So you basically get them to create news articles, because the problem is if you just get them to dissect things, they become cynical. And that's a real problem, right? Then they say, oh, well, nothing is real, nothing is true. But if you actually get them to create news articles, they realize like, oh, wait, to get this to 800 words, I need to select things. That doesn't mean that it's untrue, but I'm sort of working within this medium. So that's one, is kind of within. So there's a great organization in the UK that gets students to do that at schools, and often working with people who are first gen, disadvantaged backgrounds, etc. And that's been very successful. Another is that there are a whole host of sort of smaller interventions that particularly psychologists have been experimenting with. So they're all small, but they do have demonstrable effects. So things like, if you ask people before they repost something, are they sure? Have they read it? Twitter used to do this. It actually did have some effects. So that came out of an experiment, just getting people to reflect a little bit on, why am I doing this? Taking a short pause. One of the experiments showed if you primed people to think about whether something was accurate before they sent it, they were less likely to spread something that was problematic. So those are a few examples. That, again, some of them are small bore. They're just things that bring this down a couple percentage points. But because something, when it goes viral, it's got to build on, one person sends it to 5, sends it to another 5. It very quickly goes viral. You stop and cut off a couple of those pathways, suddenly it doesn't go as viral. So I think we can think about those small bore things as well. And then finally, I think also being forgiving that everyone makes mistakes and understanding that some of it's not nefarious, it's confusion, it's mistakes. And maybe the very final one is always, if somebody's asking you for money, just take a big pause.
I'll second that one. Yes.
That's like
that's actually a great way of sort of starting to come to a close, because we only have a couple of minutes left. But I did want to come back to something that Walter had said earlier about his big concern being partisan politics and sort of the political content of some of the memes and other social media things that we're seeing as well at the moment. We are in a big election year, not just for the United States, but really around the world. And so maybe as we think about the rest of the year and all of the elections that are taking place, I would welcome comments from each of you on sort of things that you think that we should do as consumers of information to make sure that we're not falling prey to disinformation, that we're not as susceptible to it. But also maybe things to watch as we try to follow campaigns at home and abroad, so that we can discern between what's misinformation and what's not. No specific question there, but I'd just love to hear your thoughts on disinformation in an election year and what we can do to save ourselves.
I guess one thing that I would say is just having, I think, an awareness that things like deep fakes are often being predominantly used against female candidates. So just an awareness that the kinds of problems we're talking about here are disproportionately affecting sometimes of candidates over others. And one of the reasons that's so important is because then it means they have to spend all this time on deep fakes and not actually doing campaigning. So just, I think, having an awareness of the gender dimension is super important.
One tip from me, I'd say unplug a bit. I realize these news cycles move so rapidly, and I feel, again, a lot of people become just obsessed with monitoring the minute by minute political information. That's an easy way for disinformation to slip in, because, again, you're just getting too much information too quickly. Step back and, again, maybe read like a news weekly instead, right? And you're going to get like a much more reasonable perspective of what's happening. And again, you're not really going to miss out, in a week, right? I just don't see that happening. And again, I think that might calm folks down, just a little bit, perhaps.
Well, a huge thanks to both of you for taking the time to talk with me today. I feel like this hour has gone by so quickly and we could easily have continued on for much longer. So maybe we do come back to this topic in a few months again, because certainly this topic is not going away anytime soon. But a huge thanks to you, Heidi, and to you, Walter, for taking the time to be with us.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Thanks,
And
Heidi,
let me
for being
just
a great conversation partner.
Likewise.
Yeah, it's been really enjoyable, and I have to maybe make one last plug for the German consulate and for the DWIH here in New York. They are going to be organizing an event in the not too distant future titled Bridging the Gap on Safeguarding Online Freedom Across the Atlantic, and you can find out more about that at dwih-nework.org. That's coming up in the next few weeks, and I'm sure that some of our viewers might be interested in finding out more about it.